So in terms of the time frame, Bitcoin topped, it was perfect. Q4 top, October even, perfect time frame. But if you look at actual topping indicators, basically none of them flashed as a top on Bitcoin. Now, I was one that was consistently saying that a lot of them wouldn't flash. Do you guys remember all those people that would always look at that one site by CoinGlass, the Bitcoin top indicators, and they'd always go on about all these different arbitrary top indicators, and they'd make out that Bitcoin has to top out when all of these flash. Absolute drivel, absolute nonsense, low IQ, stupid individuals were suggesting that. I was suggesting that this time we would actually have a bit of a lackluster top, and Bitcoin would top out with a slight higher high. Not a major blow off top, but we would have, maybe some form of decent bull run, but not anything special. I was never calling for 150 to 200. My range on Bitcoin since day one was always 117 to 130. Sometimes I said 120, sometimes I said 125, sometimes I said 130, sometimes I said 117. But anywhere in that range was always my Bitcoin topping range. Okay, so I think it's important to just add context and let you guys know that we did have, by all measures in terms of price, an unusual top. Like I said, in terms of the date it topped, not unusual at all. The date that we topped was completely normal. Nothing strange about that being an October post-halving top. Completely normal. What was different was the fact that we topped on boredom. Some people call it apathy. But the reality is we did not top on euphoria. You can look at the fear and greed index. You can look at all those arbitrary indicators that people were talking about, which, let's be real, some of them did flash last cycle. But basically none of them flashed this time. The power law was invalidated. The pi cycle was invalidated. All of these major indicators that people were looking at and focusing on so ardently, all essentially are defunct now. And I always had that belief that we would have some form of lackluster bull market and we wouldn't see the traditional blow off top on Bitcoin. It was almost too obvious because every single person was saying 150 to 200. Bitcoin become mainstream. And I just felt like this would not be the time where we would see that kind of blow off top. So I think it's important when we're discussing the bear market to understand the context of the bull market. It's very important, and a lot of people are not adding that important context. They're talking about the bear market and they're making predictions about the bear market, but they're not factoring in the lackluster bull market which we had, which is very important context, and I'm going to tell you why in a moment. So, Bitcoin, by all measures, had a lackluster top in terms of price. Therefore, I think it is reasonable to suggest that the bear market is not going to be as deep because the bull market was not as high. I think it's reasonable. I think there's a degree of logic in that argument. Now, I'm not saying it has to be that way. I'm not saying we have to have a tamed bear market just because we had a tamed bull market, but I'm saying that there is a logical bit of reasoning behind that claim. And you'll see a lot of people on YouTube, a lot of people on X, bashing anyone who's suggesting that, saying that it's idiocy, saying that it doesn't make sense. But I do believe there's a degree of logic in that train of thought. I'm not saying it has to be that way. I'm not saying just because we had a tamed bull market, we can't go and have a very deep bear market. We absolutely could have that. And one example I would point to, which obviously has nothing to do with crypto, but in terms of the candlesticks, in terms of the bars, if you go and look at 2008, before we had the major crash, 2008 wasn't after a major parabolic blow off top new high on the S&P 500. It was essentially a double top that it did. So this idea that you can't have a deep bear market just because you didn't have a euphoric bull market is untrue. Okay? But that doesn't mean that there is also logic in the argument that there is obviously more of a chance that this bear market isn't as brutal because of the bull market not being as euphoric. There is logic in that argument. Okay? So hopefully everyone understands what I'm saying. What I'm saying in summary is there is more of a chance that this bear market isn't as brutal, but that doesn't mean that it can't be brutal. That doesn't completely invalidate the fact that it could be brutal. Of course it could be brutal. 2008 was a brutal crash, and that was not after a massive euphoric blow off top all-time high on the S&P 500. So you can have a brutal bear market, even if the bull market wasn't amazing. Just getting that out of the way, okay? Very, very important context. So, where do I see us potentially bottoming? I've said many times I see us bottoming between 40k to 60k. That's the range I've given for a long time. I got my top range right. Let's see if I get my bottom range right. And I've been saying this for months, by the way. I've been saying this since maybe October time, that this was the bottom range. Now, technically it's 39k would be the lower target, but let's just call it 40k for the sake of argument, because if we say 39, we're just being awkward. But technically speaking, my lower target is 39k. That's the low target. That's the bear case. The bull case would be kind of around the 200-week moving average, okay? Which is around 60k. So this makes sense. Bull case, 200-week is the bottom. Bear case, 786 fib retracement is the bottom. Every single bear market, Bitcoin has come down to the macro 786 fib. Every single bear market. I'm arguing this time it might not do that. Okay? Because that would be my bear case, not my base case. My base case bottom is actually the golden pocket. That is my base case bottom, is somewhere in the mid-50s. That's what I think is the most likely form of bottom for Bitcoin, which really means it's just one more move lower. And that would make sense if you look at the shorter time frame, where we are currently in a bear pennant. If you look at this, the shorter time frame, we've actually currently broke down from a bear pennant. We've actually had a breakdown here. So if you actually measure that move, the expected dump would be to like the mid-50s. So that adds up in a short-term analysis format, and it also adds up on a macro analysis because you've got your 200-week moving average and your macro golden pocket both lining up around the same point. Now, what a lot of people say is in 2022, we actually lost the 200-week moving average, which is a fair argument. But people forget that in 2022, we had two major events that led to an even deeper bear market based off the moving averages. Based off percentage, it was a diminishing return. But based off the moving averages, we actually had a more brutal bear market in 2022 than we actually had in 2019, based off the moving averages, not based off percentage. Now, why was that the case? Well, we had two major events that dropped Bitcoin below the 200-week moving average. One event was less obvious, the other was very obvious, okay? The first obvious event was FTX, the collapse of FTX. And the fact that people were hearing about that, they started selling off, and then it was the major Black Swan event at the very end. The second event was the recession under Joe Biden. Very covered up recession, wasn't talked about, but there was very much a recession under Joe Biden during his presidency. But like I said, it was covered up, but the economy was in a bad state. If you go back to 2022 and you look at a lot of the tech stocks, they were crumbling. And that was after a major rally during COVID. They had a massive drawdown after the 2021 highs. So you had multiple things all affecting Bitcoin that led to it going below the 200-week moving average. Now, my argument, and it's been very, very crystal clear, is for Bitcoin to go significantly below the 200-week, not just a couple percent, but significantly below it, meaning 40k or less. I think we need a Black Swan event. At least maybe one, maybe two. You would need some form of FTX crisis, some form of pandemic, some form of World War III. Maybe Iran is the situation that could bring us below it. But it would have to really, really go off badly. It couldn't just be a few strikes on military bases and stuff like that. It has to be serious. Like a mass casualty event for us to go that low, in my opinion. Unless it's just a super drawn-out bear market, which is always possible. I think there's a likely scenario where we find a bear market low in the 50,000 region, the 50s, rather than going deep into the 40s and the 30s. I think there's a very strong scenario that the 50s could be respected. But it's not impossible. I want to make it very clear. I'm not saying that anything is impossible. I'm not saying that 30k or 40k is impossible. What I'm saying is it's not my base case, and I'm telling you what I believe would have to happen in order for that to be the case. So in order for us to go down to the 786 or lower, I believe that we would need some major black swan event. It could be directly affecting crypto itself, like a major exchange, like a stablecoin, or it could be an external event such as a World War III, such as a pandemic or something like that, right? We can't always predict these things, but that's why they're black swans, right? They happen out of nowhere. So black swans are always possible, but I'm not necessarily factoring them into my base case. Now we get into the time discussion, which is the main purpose of this discussion. The main purpose of this is the time side of things. Now, everyone is saying we have to bottom in Q4. Everyone's saying, sell your crypto, come back in Q4. Turn the laptop off, turn your screen off, just delete your crypto apps and just come back in Q4. Forget about everything, forget about the news, forget about Bitcoin, forget about alts, just come back in Q4. Everyone's saying that. Don't you think it's a little bit too obvious? Don't you think it's a little bit too obvious? Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, well, what about the 4-year cycle top that we just had in October? That was in line with the cyclical trend, so surely the bottom has to be. Now, I've had some deep thought about this, and a lot of it is intuition, okay? Some of this I'm just going off feeling, which I know some people say is a bad thing, but honestly, I think some of the best investors, they trust their gut, they trust their intuition sometimes. And I just have this inclination to believe that a lot of people are going to get wrecked because they're going to miss the bottom. Because they're all waiting until Q4, and they're all holding stables, and they're not going to deploy anything until Q4. They're not even going to get their feet wet, let alone going deep into the deep end. They're not even going to get their toes wet. And the reason for that is they are so damn certain that Q4 has to be the bottom. 100% certain. That's how certain they are. And when people have that degree of certainty, they typically tend to get wrecked in markets. That's typically what happens. When there's such a high prevalence of an opinion, when something becomes the consensus viewpoint, when everyone believes it, they typically end up getting wrecked. Maximum pain happens. Now, I know you guys are going to say, well, what about the Q4 top? That was in line with expectation. Well, was it really? Because I was running lots of polls. I've done it a few times on when do you believe Bitcoin would top. Most people didn't think it would top in line with the 4-year cycle. Yes, that was the obvious scenario, but everyone was doubting it. Everyone was saying, actually, I think we're going to go into 2026. It's going to be an extended cycle. Some people were saying we'll top out to the left of it. Very few people actually stuck by the 4-year cycle and sold during October. Very few people. Maybe the smart money did it, but if you went around retail and you asked people, when do you believe the top will be? I'm not kidding. 90% of YouTubers were saying it wouldn't be Q4. 90% of investors were probably saying it wouldn't be Q4. Everyone was saying either extended cycle or left-leaning cycle. So very few people actually sold in October believing that was the top. But now everyone's saying it has to be Q4 simply because October was the top. So they say the 4-year cycle's still intact. October proves that. Therefore, it has to be a Q4 bottom. And I think that is going to be the trap. The trap is going to be everyone got wrecked not selling in October. So now they're saying, I'm out. I'm out of the game. I'm sitting on my hands until Q4. And they're going to get wrecked that time. Because this market will always cause maximum wreckage. It will always be maximum pain. I genuinely think very few people sold in Q4 or like in October. So many people were expecting an extended cycle because of QE, because of this, because of that. Now, I always had my invalidation point, which was the 50-week moving average, which got invalidated, I think, in early November. That was my invalidation point. That was the point where I sold all the remains I had. But I was taking profits on the way up. But most people, I would say, round-tripped. I don't know the percentage. I can't necessarily give a percentage. I guess we'd have to do a poll, and then we'd have to assume that most people are honest, and we'd have to assume that everyone had to answer it. Because if we did a poll on how many people round-tripped, there'd be a lot of people who were too embarrassed to actually answer the poll. Because I did that poll in my Discord, and loads of the people in the group who I know round-tripped did not answer the poll. So it's hard to get an accurate reading on the percentage of people who round-trip, because most people who round-tripped are too embarrassed. They don't want to mention it. But I would hazard a guess, and I would say that maybe 70% of people round-tripped in the crypto market. Therefore, most people got it wrong. Therefore, most people got wrecked. And I would also guess that 70% of people are in stables right now waiting for a Q4 bottom, because they probably sold the bottom. They didn't sell at the top. They didn't sell at the loss of the 50. They probably sold in panic during this massive dump, right? That's what retail do. Retail capitulate, the masses I'm talking about. Not necessarily everyone on this channel, but the masses that watch the normie channels and the crap channels out there. They typically sell on the major capitulation dump. Either there or there they probably sold. And now they're in stables and they got wrecked. And they're saying, I'm not buying until Q4. That's what they're waiting for. So they're probably going to get wrecked again, in my opinion. They're going to sell low and they're going to end up buying high. Because if we start leaving the station, let's just say in the summer, they're going to start jumping in with FOMO. And that's how you have maximum wreckage in this market. Another thing I'm going to mention is this absolute obsession with $40,000. I've already explained $40,000 is a key level, or if we want to be fully specific, it's $39,000. I've explained that is a major level. But the obsession with it is getting crazy now. Everyone is waiting for 40K. And again, when everyone is waiting for something, typically it doesn't happen. Not always. Not always. You know, there's a saying, the masses are always wrong. That saying's actually wrong. The masses aren't always wrong. They're just wrong most of the time. Not always, but maybe 70 or 80% of the time they're wrong. So everyone's saying 40K. I'm not going to buy until 40K. That's what the majority of people are saying. Again, not buying until Q4, not buying until 40K. It worries me. I worry for those people. I mean, if they pull it off and they buy the bottom, happy days. You bought the bottom. Great. You timed it better than me. But if it doesn't get pulled off and they're full on this kind of all-in, all-out approach of they have to time the exact bottom and they don't even want to get their feet wet right now when we have great prices, if it doesn't work, they're going to get absolutely wrecked and they're going to jump in on FOMO. And they'll probably buy in around the time Bitcoin gets to 90 or 100K. That's when they'll buy in. Once we approach that major psychological level of 100K is when they'll FOMO back in. And by that point, altcoins are probably already up 2 to 5x from the lows. And they've missed those gains. So look, I want to be very clear. I'm not talking deterministically. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm just talking from, I guess a lot of it is a gut feeling. Because I'll admit, my argument is relatively weak. Because I'm going against the norm. I'm going against the trend. I'm going against the grain. I will admit that I am going against the grain. And that maybe, from purely a probability standpoint, my scenario for most people, for most objective people, would be not the base case. Not only am I arguing for the bottom to be earlier than Q4, but I'm also arguing that the bear market won't necessarily be as deep as the 786 fib. So I'm making two arguments against the norm. So it is contrarian. Therefore, it isn't necessarily the probabilistic base case. But I'm just telling you what I think. That's why you guys watch the channel, right? I'm telling you what I think. You know what else wasn't against? You know what else was against the norm? A 126,000 top on Bitcoin. That was against the norm. because not a single top signal flashed, yet I was still saying that that would be the topping range, 117 to 130. I was adamant that that would be the topping range, and that was completely and utterly against the norm. Not a single major top signal flashed at that range. Everyone was waiting for 150 to 200 for the top signals to start flashing. I think a lot of them would have flashed around 170. That was the flashing range. None of that happened. So that stance was against the norm, that stance was contrarian, and that stance paid off. So let's see if it happens this time.